Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Berechot, chapter 3, Halacha 6. Today we're finishing up the parak, and we learned before that a person who has a seminal discharge and he becomes a balakari may not, under a decree by Ezra the scribe, say words of Torah or prayer until he immerses in 40 seah of water. Now, the Mishnah is going to discuss several cases concerning a person who is afflicted by another form of tumah in addition to the tumah of seminal emission. Now, one of the things when you go and you look at in Kalim, in the first Mishnah in Kalim, it will list out a order of degree for the things that cause tumah in an ascending way. And the semen for a man is one of the most things that causes tumah. It's a lot, right? Like you have the corpses the most, but the semen for a man is right up there. So now we're going to talk about what happens if you have more than just one kind of tumah. That's what chapter Halacha 6 is going to get into. Now, interestingly enough, a zav, we're going to start off in the Mishnah talk about a zav. A zav is going to be a person that has a particular type of discharge, and I've seen before that it's something from an STD. I think it's gonorrhea, and it's a type of involuntary discharge that comes, and it's a very serious type of tumah. And actually, for it, when they have it, they have to count 7 clean days. And in other words, 7 clean days where there's no emission. And if he's in the middle of counting and there's an emission, he has to, wait and start again. So it's a very serious, severe form of tumah, severe level of tumah, and in fact, the zav has to go to get a special kind of water for the purification. In other words, just going into a regular kind of mikvah may not work for him, because the Torah specifically says that it has to be from spring water. It has to actually be from a special kind of water. So they have to he has to actually, it's Mayim Chaim, which is living water, which is a spring. And he actually has to go find this special kind of water to go purify himself. It's not just going into a normal mikvah. So the rules for it are very severe, and there's also not just a zav, but a zava. That's also a possibility. So if you want to learn more about gonorrhea, you can look it up. There's all sorts of horrible emissions that come about from it. I don't know because I've never studied it, but I've just heard about it. Anyway, and medically, I'm sure that it's true. Anyway, the Mishnah starts off and says, a zav who experienced a seminal emission, and a nida who emits semen after an act of cohabitation. So, by the way, this is talking about a nida who emits semen after an act of cohabitation. Now, a nida is a woman who had her period, and she's tamei for 7 days. That's in Leviticus. That's Doraita. And after that, she goes to a valid mikvah, and then she becomes tahor. Now, rabbinically, she cannot immerse without counting 7 clean days. And the woman in this case, okay, the woman who discharges semen following an act of cohabitation is tamei to the same degree as a man who emits semen. And like a man, she is going to be subject to the immersion required by Ezra before reciting words of the Torah. And this Mishnah is talking about a woman who engaged in cohabitation and then she became a nida. The Mishnah is not talking about a woman who cohabited while being a nida, because that would be a very serious problem for both. And the being with a nida is so serious that it actually you're violating two prohibitions in the Torah. One violation is going to be specifically written out there for the man not to be with a nida, and the second one will be for the woman not to be with a man while a nida. So if you are with a nida, you actually violate two things of the two prohibitions against the Torah, and it's very serious because even in a case like you can see in chapter 7, Halacha 2 of the Yerushalmi, that Rabbi Akiva is arguing that being with a nida is actually more severe than breaking Shabbat, because breaking Shabbat is written as a single prohibition, and you see how serious breaking Shabbat is. Rabbi Akiva is arguing that you actually get two infractions against the Torah for being with a nida, whereas breaking Shabbat, you're getting one infraction from the Torah. So this is very serious, and the Mishnah is only talking about someone who had relations and then she became a nida, and the Gemaras and the Shasas will say that semen can be emitted for up to 3 days afterwards, where the semen is still viable. So that also, by the way, fits with what's medically known, that the semen can be viable for up to 3 days. So in this case, where the woman is afflicted with both the tumah of nida and the tumah of keri, okay, that's what's going to be this interesting twist about it. Okay, you're not just tamei from one thing, you're tamei from two things. So now you have this tumah of keri, and that can be removed by going to 40 say of water, okay? And that of the nida, you have to wait 7 days before you go to a mikveh. So the Mishnah is really going to be getting into this question of whether Ezra's decree is going to require a woman to immerse for the tumah of keri. Now, if it's a case where the woman is not a nida, then if under Ezra's thing, that if she has relations and then the semen comes out, 3 days later, she is having the same level of tuma of the bal keri, and she has to go to the mikveh. So that's going to be the ruling on that. And so in this case, what's going to happen? Now, the woman, if she immersed immediately after cohabiting before she became a nida, and she purified herself from the initial tumah, that's going to be one thing. But after becoming a nida, if she contracted the tumah of keri by emitting the semen that she received before she was a tumah, that's going to be another thing. And the significance is going to get pointed out in this Gemara. Now, I want to point out something about this, that the tumah of a woman who emits semen is actually going to be in the scriptural account of Har Sinai itself. And we know that, before the Torah is given, the people were instructed to not have intimacy for 3 days. And why would that be? Because they would not be tamei on the moment of divine revelation of Har Sinai, which is the most important human event in all of history. So, although you have tumah that came through an act of cohabitation, and it could be removed through immersion only, after, a single day, you needed to have 3 days to ensure purity, because she can omit that viable seed up to 3 days, and if it came on the third day, that's the point where she would have to go to the mikvah. So you would have, a case where you had to have the people out for 3 days. Now, I just want to point out that that's going to be related to viable semen. In other words, semen that's capable of fertilization. That's what's going to generate tumah. So after 3 days in the womb, the semen deteriorates and doesn't become viable. So after 3 days, that discharge, if a woman were to have discharge, she would not be tamei, and because it would not be viable. So that's the key point here. And the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, and a woman who cohabited and then experienced a needed discharge, all these require immersion in 40 seah of water before they may recite the words of the Torah. So Rashi in the Bavli in 21b, the parallel to this, here's what Rashi says. Rashi says, in each of these cases, even if the person immerses to remove the tumah of Keri, he or she will not become tahor, since each of these people is afflicted also with a form of tumah that cannot be removed through the immersion of being a ziva or a nida. A ziva is a zav who has this gonorrhea condition, but for a woman. Anyway, although their immersion will not achieve Tara, the Tanakama requires them to immerse so that the impediment of Keri, at least, will be removed before the words of Torah are recited. So that's one of the key ideas over here, is that she has this roadblock. Now, the Gemara is going to continue, or the Mishnah is going to continue. It says, but Rabbi Yehuda exempts them from this immersion. So it's going to be a case where Rabbi Yehuda is going to rule that wherever a person is afflicted with another more stringent form of tumah, in addition to Keri, the person is not required to immerse. And we're going to get into that reasoning, why Rabbi Yehuda says that in the Gemara. And basically, we learned in an earlier Mishnah before that Rabbi Yehuda is going to rule that a Baal Keri may recite blessings before and after the Shema, and before and after the meals without immersing, and this is not because Rabbi Yehuda does not accept the requirement to immerse before reciting the words of Torah. Rather, Rabbi Yehuda holds that Ezra mandated immersion only for the words of the Torah. Now, let's get into the Gemara, and the Gemara is going to talk about the view of Rabbi Yehuda. What is Rabbi Yehuda's view? And let's get into it. It says, until now, Rabbi Yehuda stated his exemption in the case of a Zav who experienced a seminal emission where the tumah of the Zav preceded the tumah of seminal emission. So this is a case where for a man, a man has two things that's happening, It's two types of tumah. One tumah is going to be from the Zav. So that's your gonorrhea acting up, and you have an emission from the gonorrhea, and then you have a seminal emission after that. So you have one from becoming tamei from the seminal emission, and then you have one from the zav. Another thing about the zav having to go to the water of life, this living water, right, from the spring water, is that without the Torah specifically telling you that the Zav has to go to this special spring, that there's no way to derive in the law or the oral law any kind of inclination that the Zav would have to go to a different kind of thing other than a mikvah. And the precision of the Torah is that it tells you, no, the Zav has to go to this other kind of spring, not just a mikvah. And there'd be no way to know that law without the Torah actually telling it to you in black and white. And it is written there in black and white. There's no way to derive it or to understand that law without that being written in there by the Torah, because you would look at that type of tuma, you would know it's a type of tuma, but you wouldn't know that, cleaning it would be anything other than just going to a mikveh, and it's not. You have to go to a special spring, and the Torah is very precise, and it tells you that this is a special type of tuma with a more serious level, and you need a special kind of water to clean you. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, but does his exemption apply even in the case of a person contaminated through seminal emission who subsequently experienced a ziva discharge? In other words, where the tuma of the seminal emission preceded that of the zav. So what's going to be the case where you have the seminal emission and then you have the zav, and then what's going to be the case where you have the zav and then the seminal emission? So I want to point out something about this from the Ritva. The Ritva is saying that Rabbi Yuda's ruling might apply only in the case in the Mishnah where the person was already a zav before he admitted semen. And according to this suggestion, Rabbi Yuda's reasoning is as follows. This is the note by the Ritva. Okay, it says, from the time this person acquired Tuma of Keri, there was never a moment at which his immersion could have achieved Tara, since he was anyway contaminated with the Tuma of being a Ziva. And that cannot be removed through this immersion. That's the point. You can't just go into a mikvah to get rid of the Tuma of Ziva. And the note continues and says, because at that point, that he could have been purified through the immersion, he was never subject to Ezra's decree to immerse before reciting the words of the Torah. And the decree applies only where one will immerse and purify somebody of Tuma. Now, I want to point out something from the Haredim about this. Haredim says that where somebody has seminal emission before becoming a Zav, there was a point at which the person could have been purified through immersion, namely before he contracted Tuma of Zav, because immersion at that point would have achieved Tara after the nightfall. And the person became subject at that time to Ezra's decree requiring immersion. And once this obligation takes effect, it remains in effect even if the person subsequently contracts another type of Tuma. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda must admit that in this case, the person does not require an immersion. Now, on the other hand, it is possible, says the Haredim, that Rabbi Yehuda's ruling is not based on the idea that immersion will not purify the person, but has another basis altogether in which his ruling might apply even where the person is first contaminated with this seminal emission and only afterwards becomes a zav. And indeed, an alternate line of reasoning would be supported in this view of Rabbi Yehuda's ruling. So the Gemara is going to resolve this question and say, hey, which is it? The Gemara says, let us learn the answer from the question from this teaching of our Mishnah. A woman who cohabited and then experienced a needed discharge requires immersion in 40 say of water, but Rabbi Yehuda exempts her from this immersion. Now, the amazing thing about this is the Mishnah is unbelievably precise, and the point at what they're trying to get at is when you're having somebody who's getting two very different kinds of tuma. So, and they have a commonality where they have to both wait 7 days. The Zav has to wait 7 days, count 7 clean days, and so does the woman when she's in Nida. But it's possible where they can have another kind of emission that makes them like a Baal Keri. So you can end up with two situations. And what does the Mishnah do? They put both of these cases together. Why? Because, says the Gemara, we're trying to learn the answer from this one, from that one. And that's why they're putting it together. It's unbelievably precise. And the more you study the Mishnah, the more you really see precision in the world. in the case of the tuma, okay, where the tuma of the seminal emission precedes the tuma of the nida, Rabbi Yehuda rules that a woman is not required to immerse, and the same is true where the tuma of the seminal emission precedes the tuma of the zav. Now, I want to point out a note by the Mara Fulda. Mara Fulda says like this, says that where the tumas carry preceded tumas nida, there was a moment at which the woman could have immersed and been purified before she became a nida. Nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda rules that now that she became a nida, she need not immerse. And we see that even in such a case, Rabbi Yehuda's ruling would apply. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about another version of the same question in which the reasoning behind each side of the inquiry is going to get looked at. So, Gemara starts off and says, what is Rabbi Yehuda's reasoning in ruling that a zav who experienced a seminal emission need not immerse? And it says that it might be that, we say, of what use is it that he immerses if he already is contaminated with the tuma of ziva? That's the big $1 million question here. And here's what the Haredim says about this. It says that this is a reasoning that was presented before, that where the person was already a zav before they became a bal keri, and the immersion is therefore unable to purify him, he is not going to be subject to Ezra's decree requiring immersion before the recitation of the words of the Torah. That's the note by the Haredim. Now, Pnei Moshe says about this, says that according to the view of Rabbi Yehuda's ruling, it would not apply in the case of one who experienced a seminal emission before he became a zav. So that's going to be, a big point here. So the question is going to get asked in another way. And here's how it says. It says, or perhaps we reason that a lesser form of tuma is of no significance alongside a greater form of tuma. That's really going to be what the question is. And here's what the Haredim says. It says, according to this side of questioning, Rabbi Yehuda reasons that where a person has acquired a stringent form of tuma, such as that of a zav, the lesser form of keri, which is inconsequential in the presence of the greater form of tuma, it's going to be treated with regards to Ezra's decree as if it never took effect. So this is asking, says the Haredim, that a zav who experiences a seminal emission is not required to immerse. So that's there's a lot of moving parts on here, and the Gemara is going to analyze this question. And here's what it says. It says, what practical difference emerges from between these two views? In other words, what's going to be the difference about if they became tamei before from a more serious one, or they had the more serious one first, and then they had the less serious one after? The Gemara is going to explain. It says, the difference emerges when a person experiences a seminal emission and subsequently experiences a ziva discharge. Now, why would that be? The Haredim is saying that, basically is saying that, let us learn the answer from the teaching of the Mishnah that a woman who cohabited and then experienced a needed discharge requires immersion. And Rabbi Yehuda, as we saw, exempts her from the immersion. And in effect, this is coming as proof that Rabbi Yehuda's reasoning that the lesser tuma is of no significance alongside the greater tuma. That's one way to interpret what this is saying. And this is the methodology by the Haredim on this. So the Gemara is going to say that if you say Rabbi Yehuda's reasoning is that of what use is it that he immerses if he is contaminated with a ziva emission, in that case, the reasoning does not apply, for the immersion, says the Gemara, could have been of use in the period before he became a zav. So the Haredim points out that in this case, Rabbi Yehuda would agree that the person must immerse even after becoming a zav. And if, however, Rabbi Yehuda reasons that a lesser form of tuma is not significant alongside a greater form of tuma, then in that case he would also exempt the person from immersing. In other words, the question is going to be about what do we do about this lesser form of tuma that comes about after a greater form of tuma. And the Gemara is going to conclude. It's going to say that Rabbi Yuda's reasoning is only that a lesser form of tuma is of no significance alongside a greater form of tuma. Now, the Haredim explains about this that we see in the Mishnah a case of a woman who cohabited and then she became a nida, and that Rabbi Yuda's ruling applies even where the tuma of seminal emission precedes the tuma of the nida or ziva. And it follows that his reasoning is not that an immersion performed after becoming a zav does not purify the person, but that the lesser form of keri is of no significance alongside the more stringent tuma of zav. And accordingly, once a bali keri contracts tumas ziva, he is no longer required to immerse before reciting the words of the Torah. So the Gemara is going to talk about a third version of this question. So it's very similar in both Talmudic traditions, in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, to cite several versions of a single teaching or question. Okay, and now the version that's coming up is going to be identical, but it only differs in the wording. Okay, so there's going to be some nuance in here. So the Gemara continues, says, until now, Rabbi Yudah stated his exemption only where the lesser tuma came at the end. In other words, that you had the more serious tuma that came first, like the tuma of the zav, and then you had the lesser form of tuma come where you have the seminal emission. So the question is going to be over here, or by the way, like in the case of the woman, that she became a nida first, and then the semen that was there from before she was a nida came out. Okay, so the Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to say, but does his exemption apply even where the greater tuma came at the end? In other words, what is going to be where the tuma of the zav follows the tuma of the seminal emission? In other words, what happens when you have the lesser form of tuma happen first? So let's say he becomes tameh from having the seminal emission first, and then 10 minutes later he becomes a zav. Or let's say that the semen comes out of the woman first, and then 10 minutes later she's a nida. Okay, so what's going to happen in that case? And the Gemara is going to resolve it for us. It says that let us learn the answer to this question from the teaching of the Mishnah. It says, and a woman who cohabited and then experienced a nida discharge requires immersion in 40 seah of water, but Rabbi Yudah exempts her from this immersion. In other words, that's going to be like what we talked about before, where Rabbi Yudah would be ruling that it would only it would be a case where the reasoning is as follows, right? It says from time to time a person can acquire the tuma of keri where there was never a moment in which his immersion could have achieved tara, since he was anyway contaminated with the tuma of ziva and cannot be removed through that immersion. In other words, let's say that you had the seminal emission first and 10 minutes later became a zava. You never had the opportunity to have tara. That's the point of what that would be in Rabbi Yudah's statement. Now, the Gemara is going to conclude about this, and it's going to tie it all up. It says, indeed, this tells us that this case where the greater tuma came at the end, in other words, you had the lighter form of tuma that comes first, and then the serious case of tuma that comes after, like in this case where the guy had the seminal discharge first, and 10 minutes later he has a zav emission, which is a greater form of tuma. So that's going to be the case that it says that, in this case where the greater tuma comes after the lesser form of tuma, it's going to be like that one where the lesser tuma came at the end and vice versa. In other words, that, just as the Zav who emitted semen is not required to immerse according to Rabbi Yehuda, so too one who emitted semen and then subsequently became a Zav is also not going to be required to immerse. So literally what this is saying is that this case is like that case, and it's both going to be interchangeable. So we're going to be getting into chapter 4, which is going to be talking about the laws of the Shema, and prayer is the service of the heart, and that's going to be a key point about this. So have a great day.